Hi, in this video I will explain about the checklist of the final project of this subject that is called microcontrollers. Well, in this case you have to send some evidence that I will explain in this document. So if you remember, this is the last unit of the course, is the fourth unit. So the 100% of the qualification will be about the final project. So let's explain what you have to send to evaluate this unit, okay? Well, remember the learning result of this unit. That says that you will be able to solve real problems in mechatronic systems that involve the use of microcontrollers. So in this case, well, the first thing that we see in this learning result is that you have to use a microcontroller as the brain of your system to solve real problems. That is important because we will do a real application of your circuit of your system that you have to implement physically, and you have to explain what is the advantage of the use in this real application of your final project. So the first thing that you have to send, well, I will define a date where you have to send the project specification. That is the first step where you have to define what you will do. So in this case, you have to describe the operation of the system step by step, including the real application, what will be the real use of that, and what it will be used for example, some devices, some circuits, the microcontroller that you will use, where it will be implemented. For example, you can implement that physically on your own house, on your own room, or maybe if you have some uncle or your parents have some grocery store or another business or a workshop that you can implement your system, where, well, in that case you can do, and you have to mention where it will be implemented, okay? And the last thing is the communication protocol that you will use. In that case, you have to mention the device usage. If you remember, we see about the communication protocols, for example, USB, or maybe RFID, or Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth. So in that case, you have to use one of them to send some data to your system, or to visualize, for example, in your computer or your cell phone, or in another display, okay? Well, this specification will be mentioned in maximum 10 lines. So it's limited by this space, in this case, of the document, because it's only a brief description of your project that you have to write in this square that I let the space to write in this. So in that case, you have to send in the link that I mentioned. Is for example, maybe the next week I will define one for each group. So in this case, it's important this note, because at the time that you send that specification, the submit specification cannot be changed later. So you have to include that on the final report. I will mention that on the checklist of the final project. And in some case, if you change something of that paragraph of your specifications, you will lose 1 point of the final project grade. That is mentioned in the checklist. So it's important. For example, if you say, well, I will display some information in one red LED, for example, and at the end you use a green LED because you don't have a red LED. Well, in that case, maybe if you don't change the specification, well, I will load the qualification in this point. I will explain later in this video in the operation, because you don't match with the specification that you mentioned. If you, for example, use another LED and you change the specification that is in this part, I will explain that. Well, maybe in that point you will lose 1 point in that moment. So the idea is maybe, or the tip is that you only say, well, I will use a LED. Maybe don't mention the color or another characteristic. So in that case, you can use another type of color. If you don't mention that, well, that won't be a problem to change the specification. Okay, so you have to be very clear in this first point. So you have to think about what you will do. I will give you some examples in this video of what kind of projects you can do. We have done some practice that you maybe have the idea of what can you do. So in this case, it's only to implement that in a real application, in a real environment. So let's talk about that. Well, the checklist. Well, in this case, the checklist about microcontrollers final project has the value of 100%. So here we have the column of the value of the characteristic that is mentioned here in this text, and if you match yes or no, or some percentage. The first point is that you have to deliver individually on the date indicated is another date different, for example, compared with the specification date. In this case, you have to send the request evidence. It will be a document in Word format with your last name and your name. For example, 5X, X is the letter of your group, for example, A, B, or C, and your full name. Remember that is your complete name beginning from the last name. For example, you could write 5A, Guerrero Díaz de León, Luis Guillermo. You have to write all your name starting with your last name, okay? For example, if you don't send this and you say, well, this I only lose 5%. No, is the last time that you have to send your document. If you don't send that, I cannot evaluate all the things that I will mention in this characteristic. So maybe you go to second opportunity. So in this case, for example, if you write 5D and you start with your first name and later with your last name, maybe you lose 5%. That is the meaning of this characteristic, okay? If you have some questions, some doubts, you can write that in your classroom platform at the forum, or use the email. Remember that the classroom platform at the forum doesn't have any notifications for me in this case. So if it is important, maybe you can write at the mail and I will answer all your questions, okay? Well, another characteristic that has the value of 10% says that in the operation, the system using microcontrollers, you cannot use another device, only microcontroller, will be evaluated based on the specifications indicated in the project report. You have to send this again on your project report. Checking the correct operation of the system. I will check that. A percentage compliance will be assigned according to my own criteria. So if your system, for example, doesn't match with the specification, well, maybe I give you another percentage. The example that I mentioned, if you say, I will use a red LED, but you use a green LED, maybe you don't lose all the 10%. Maybe I write right here an 8 or 9%, depends on the things that you miss or you don't match with the specifications. But in that case, is my own criteria, okay? Another thing, your system, I will check that, doesn't use a breadboard. You know that as a protoboard. It's a breadboard where you connect your circuits. Doesn't contain loose cables. You have to connect that together, your wires. For example, at the breadboard, you have to use, for example, PCB or some another devices that are already at the board, okay? That there are a lot in Arduino, for example, and doesn't use laboratory equipment. In that case, you cannot use, for example, oscilloscope, a generator, source power, and another thing. So I will check that on your project. And another thing that I will check is that mockups are not allowed. In that case, a mock-up is, for example, if you do a domotic system that turns on or turns off the lights of your house, and you use a little house For example, that little house is a mock-up. So you cannot use that on your project. You have to implement that in a real house, okay? So you have to connect that on the line of the energy, okay? So this is the operation in general of your system. I will give you some percentage. It's only 10% because I changed some things about the specification. I talked about that at the beginning of the course, but I changed some things because the next will be objective, not subjective, like the operation that I will use according to my criteria. So these characteristics that has the value of 85% is the evidence. The evidence that you send in the indicated date, that is the project report, is that you have to send a document in Word format. It's in Word format, not in PDF. The first thing is this, that has the value of 5%. If you send, for example, in PDF, well, you lose 5% in that case. Entirely in English, if you write some word in Spanish, you will lose 10% of at least 10 pages. It's the minimum quantity of pages that you have to use. You can do of 20 or 25 or 30 pages, doesn't matter, but the minimum is 10 pages. If you don't match this, you lose 5%. And this report, properly, you have to explain the complete system, and you have to include these 10 characteristics. I will explain that one by one. The first one, cover page. The cover page will include your name and a good name of the project, including a striking image. Striking image is like highlighting an image that covers your attention, for example. Well, in this case, I will mention some examples of the projects. Well, I have here some image. For example, you can do a system that irrigates your plants automatically. For example, using Arduino. Here are the box, black box that you cannot see. For example, the breadboard or the loose cables. It doesn't have anything of that. And the good name, for example, you can call irrigation with Arduino, for example. And an image, for example, there is a robot with some flowers, some plants. It's like the logo, maybe, of the system. Maybe I can write here, in this case, it's a good name and an striking image, some image that calls your attention. So in this case could be a logo. Maybe you understand that as a logo of your system or your company, anything, okay? So it could be important because it's the way that you can sell your project, maybe, I don't know. So it's important the name, a good name of your project, not only irrigation system, maybe as this example, Irrigino or another thing. This is from internet, so you have to use another, for example, but it's an idea of this first point, okay? Another point is the specification. It's the same that you previously sent without changes, and this checklist, you have to include this checklist because I will write right there the qualification. So you have to include all this shit. In that case, all the things that we have right here, you can select all the text and you can include all the specifications and the checklist in your report. Okay, is the second point. The third point is your source codes. Maybe you have more than one, so you have to include that in text mode without errors. In that case, you don't have to have errors on your code, and not in image. Remember that is the code that you can copy or paste in another way. So if you screenshot your code, is not available in this case because it's only the text. Okay, this has the value of 5%. Well, you can check, for example, the specification had the value of 10%. I almost forget that. It's the same that if you change one thing, well, you lose 1 point. It's the same that 10%, sorry. So this is the note that we have right here at the specification when you send that. Okay. Another thing, the diagrams, the fourth point. In Proteus, you can send that in FreeSync and or in Tinkercad. You can use more than one if you check if maybe the simulation or only the diagram of your circuit connection is the 5%. Remember that this is important because it's the idea of how you connect your circuit in electrical or electronic way, okay? The point number 5, tips for the use of your system, how to implement it and how to install it. It's important because you don't only do the code or the diagram or the simulation, you also implement that physically on some area of your house, your room, some another place, I don't know. You will define that, but you have to give some tips about how do you do that. Maybe with photos, maybe step by step, I don't know, maybe some problems, some troubles, troubleshooting, maybe how to solve that. That could be important because in that case, somebody can replicate that system, okay? Is the idea of this project. The point number 6 is the communication protocol that you use. You have to explain, and we write this in lowercase, the communication device used and the data that you send. Remember that it's important, the communication protocol, because it's not only, for example, for your irrigation system, that you only have this in your plants, for example. Maybe you can check the status of the plant, of the temperature, of the level of the water here in that container, in your cell phone or in your computer, or maybe in another display. So the idea is that you use a communication protocol to send some data. Or maybe you can turn on a motor, for example, for this actuator that sends the water to the plant using your cell phone. Maybe you can do that, and maybe it's in another way. Not only receive data, you can also send some data to the system, okay? And point number 7 is the real application. You have to describe the application of your system and its advantage. In this case, well, we don't mention maybe the disadvantage. The idea is that could be some system that solves a problem on your house, for example, some alarm, some I don't know, control access. We will see some ideas in this case, or examples of real application. Well, I will do that right now. We mentioned, for example, the irrigation system. If you go on vacations, maybe you can see the status of your plants when you are at the beach, I don't know. Well, this is the logo and the name that is important. Maybe a control access for your room, maybe, or for your things. Maybe you have some space that you put your personal things. Well, maybe you can include a control access. So this is a good project. You have to implement that. You see the box, the cables, and another thing that mention that. Another example could be the antibacterial gel dispenser, automatically done. You can manufacture this using maybe a 3D printer and using a servo. So it's a good project, and it has a real application right now because we have this in anywhere that we go, but we always push the gel manually. So you can do automatically without touch the dispenser, okay? There is a sensor. Well, in this case, maybe you have loose cables. This is an image of the internet, but maybe you can put that in a box or in another thing that you cannot see the cables or the wires, okay? Another thing, another example could be a automatical feeder for your pets, for your dogs or your cats. If you have that in your home, it's important. For example, if you go on vacation, it's like the plants. So in this case, well, we have this the circuit, and this has the box where somebody, well, can cover the cables, the loose cables in this case, and this could be a good project. There are many of projects that you can do. You can see that on internet maybe, or ask me if you have some doubts about that. For example, you cannot use, I mentioned that, mockups. This is an example of a house, little house. You cannot use that because you have to implement in a real house, for example. And you cannot use, for example, breadboards or the loose cables, or without box that you can cover your circuit, because in that case maybe you don't lose all the points, but it will be important because in that case is the real application maybe could affect another points. Okay, so there are some examples. You can check another. There is not the only one. So this is, for this point, the real application of your system only has the value of 5% maybe, but in that case, well, the operation or another thing maybe could be affected if you only do one little thing. So maybe you have to think about your project, maybe to have some good application. Okay, and the point number 8 is the video. You have to include in the same project report a YouTube link. You have to highlight it, because in another way maybe I don't find the link in your report, so you have to highlight that link of the video of maximum 5 minutes is 5%. If you have more of that time, maybe you lose that the percentage. Explain the complete project entirely in English language. If you don't want to explain that in English, well, only you will lose 5%. It's not too much, but it's a little time. So in that case, maybe you can do that in English. Not anything happens in that case. At the beginning of the video, you have to show your face and introduce yourself. You can say your name, your group, your career maybe, because we'll be at YouTube in that case. So in this point, you begin with your introduction, showing your face, and later you can show your system and how do you do that, or the function or the application, etc. Okay, so it's a little video, maximum 5 minutes. You can use less time. The only thing is that you have to explain that, because it's the only way that I can evaluate your project. Okay, it will be in video, not in person. And the point number 9, it is a new thing that I include, is the total project cost. I ask for this characteristic because maybe sometimes you don't know how how much you spend on your project. So you can include the Arduino, the components, the devices, the installation, I don't know. So you can have an idea of how much costs one project. So you have to include that. Maybe you can write part by part in that case, and the total of the cost of the project in this case. Okay. And the last point is the course conclusion. It's not about only the project, it's about all the course of microcontrollers. In this case, it has be a list of 4-line paragraph without spelling mistakes. In this case, well, remember that your report will be entirely in English, so this is the same, it's in English. If you don't want to lose that points, 10%. So in this case, well, maybe you can mention if you like the course, if you don't like the course, if you have some problems, if you want to change anything. This is the last course of microcontrollers that I give to mechatronics engineering here at the UPA. So in this case, the next program, we change the program of mechatronics. There is no microcontrollers course. There is another name, is embedded systems. So the idea is that we can improve the course, maybe do another things of Internet of Things, or maybe the Industry of 4.0, or maybe another types of devices. But in this case, the idea is that, well, in this course, you can do anything because there are a lot of information at the internet. So you take advantage of that, and I hope that you learn a lot. So there is your conclusion. Is individual, is your own opinion. I don't will down your qualification if you write something wrong. It doesn't matter. I will improve that. So I hope that the characteristics of this checklist of your final project is clear. And if you have some questions, you can ask me. This is not the closure of the course in this case, because maybe I will ask you to send some advance of your project, maybe someday. Well, tell me how you go with your report or your document, document or your code, sorry, or your for example, your simulation or the diagrams or something like that. So this is the last thing that we will do. Maybe I won't give you another class because it's the last one that I give you, because I start with digital electronics, maybe peripheral programming, and the last one is microcontroller. So I hope that you learn a little and you have some idea of what you can do with microcontrollers. Thank you.